Alright, hello everybody. This presentation will introduce to you the seashore characteristics in Iceland. Now, the seashore is the area where the tide comes in, basically. And as you can see on this animated figure here to the right, it shows you that the phases of the moon, they control the level of tide at each time. So the alternating cycles of high and low tide occur about twice a day or every 12 hours or so. And the magnitude of the tide varies on a monthly cycle, depending, again, as I said before, on the phases of the moon. So spring tide is when moon is new or full, and at that time it causes the greatest difference between high tide and low tide. Neap tide, on the other hand, is when the moon is half and there is the least difference between high tide and low tide. Differences in tide magnitude can be different between locations. For example, in the west of Iceland, where you can see located here with the red balloon, the difference can be around 4 meters. So the tide level and strength can vary significantly between locations. Now, the different seashores you can find wherever you are in the world are classified primarily by their substrate. In Iceland, you mainly find rocky or boulder seashores. In that sort of seashores, they can be either gravelly or cliffy. Where you have cliffy seashores with pretty large boulders, you often have more diversity of life that can grow in such habitats. So other types of seashores would be sandy seashores or beaches, and then tidal flats, which would be characterized with mud and silt. So between those different substrates, there is a great difference in the biota that can actually thrive there. And the greatest diversity of organisms is simply where there is the most stability, there is a shelter, and so that of course depends on in which direction the beach or the seashore is facing. If there is usually heavy tide or heavy surf, big breaking waves, different dominating wind directions and so forth. So many environmental factors absolutely affect how the habitat is for different kind of biota on the seashore. So as I said earlier, that rocky or boulder seashores are usually host usually a more diversity of life, is basically because they usually do provide good shelter in between the rocks. And there's often a good holdfast for the seaweed to grow as well. Now, the seashore is zonated, and here is an example of a rocky seashore. If you have a sandy beach or a mudflat, you would have a different kind of zonation, and that would not be so horizontal as you would see on rocky seashores. That you would rather see different belts just by digging into the ground and seeing different layers of animals and other organisms there. But on a rocky seashore, you can often see quite clear zonation. The zones are primarily divided into the splash zone, which is a top part of the littoral area, the littoral zone. You might have a high tide zone, where the tide only comes in when it's a high tide. And then it's a mid-tide zone, which is more often submerged than the high tide zone, and then the low tide zone, which is almost always submerged, and at least a big part of it. But the top belt of something we called a wrack zone is actually different. So the wrack zone is not only divided by these zones that you can see on this slide. The wrack zone are defined by what wrack species, kelp species, are dominating in each zone. So the top belt, which is usually rather narrow, is dominated by a spiraled wrack, which you can see here in the high tide zone on this slide. In that area, another type of wrack is also common, called the channeled wrack. The middle belt is often much, much wider, and there we have dominating the knotted wrack. And also actually there is a type of wrack that grows on the knotted wrack, called I only have the Latin name for it, called Polysiphonia lanosa. And then we have the bladder wrack, which is very characteristic for the mid-tide zone or the middle belt. And then in the lower belt, which is much for a longer part of the time is submerged, is dominated by the common rockweed and also the toothed wrack. So this is how we can often see quite obvious layers of different kinds of organisms living in certain layers in the beach. But what is easiest for us to see are these wrack belts. And within the wrack, of course, there are plenty of different kinds of animals that live there. So if we look more closely into this littoral zone and the zonation of a rocky coast, usually at the top of the seashore, above the wrack belts, there is a lichen, which basically colors the rocks black. It's just called in English black tar lichen, and in Icelandic fjörusverta, just means something that colors the beach black, but that's only occurring very high up in the shore. Now, if we look more closely into the species of wrack that we can see on the shore, which we should notice when we go up to the seashore, notice how different kinds of wracks are found in different zones. The top belt is dominated by the channeled and the spiral wrack. The middle belt is dominated by a wrack that usually has bladders, like bladder wrack and the knotted wrack. And the bladders are filled with gas, which help the wrack to stand up while it is submerged. So the air-filled balloons, or the bladders, they lift the wrack up so they can get closer to the sunlight in order to photosynthesize, just like plants do on land. And the lower belt is dominated by toothed wrack and the common rockweed. So below these wrack belts, in areas where organisms are submerged for a longer part of the time, we have a diversity of both red and green algae. And these are often much thinner, not as thick and leathery as the brown wrack. But interestingly, this kind of weed is often quite common, actually, as food. One of those, called the dulse or söl in English, söl in Icelandic, but dulse in English, is actually a very good source of minerals and vitamins compared with other vegetables. And it contains actually all the trace elements that humans need. So and also actually it has very high in protein content. So the dulse was actually a very important food source for Icelanders back in the days, and continue to be so, but not as vital for us as before. since we have everything imported more or less to this island. But before that, imagine how important such a source of food was for native Icelanders back in the days. Now, people that are interested in health and want something very organic often go to the beach during a certain time of the year, usually around June to September. That's when the dulls can actually be picked up, and just when the tide is out, it's simply hand picked. And then, of course, small snails and other pieces of stuff and organisms needs to be washed off, and then it's usually dried out in the sun. Once it's dried, it's ready to be eaten just like snacks. Now, below these green and red algae areas, we have the kelp forests, which are dominated by large growing kelp species, such as the sugar kelp, the dabberlogs, oarweed, and tangle. And actually, kelp forests provide important coastal habitat ecosystem and provide shelter for many animals, and particularly small fish and fish larvae, and also provide shelter from strong currents and waves and so forth. So not only provides shelter, but also hosts interesting and diverse ecosystem. Now, here's a poster with an overview of these wreck zones I just mentioned, and with further description of the different species. Now, I will just continue to the next slide to look into what animals we might be seeing there in the rocky seashore. Now, yeah, there are many animals that can be found on the rocks, also underneath the rocks, within the seaweed, in small pools that don't dry up, and puddles between the rocks. And again, in a rocky seashore, that's where you have the diversity, because they provide different habitats for different organisms. The animals that you are most likely to see are invertebrates, and these are very different types of invertebrates. Sponges are quite common, and also cnidarians. An example of those are, for example, sea anemones, hydrozoans, and bryozoans, which you can see here on the pictures to the right. The middle picture is of a sea anemone, and the bottom picture is actually of a bryozoa. And these are animals that grow on rocks, they grow on algae or on other animals. So these are not mobile animals, just like corals. They are just stationary, benthic. Now, there are other types of animals that actually can move around, that live in the coast, such as molluscs. And molluscs probably dominate, we could say that they dominate almost dominate the coastal areas. Molluscs are soft-bodied animals, and some of those animals actually have a outer shell made out of calcium carbonate. Chitons, they are the ones on the top picture, and can be found usually where in lower zones and where there's plenty of water. But then we also have the gastropods, which are probably the most abundant and most pronounced species in coastal areas. We can find many different kinds of gastropods, but gastropods are snails. There are both limpets. The limpets have these symmetrical shapes or shells that have a pointy middle, and just called in English limpets. But they are just like other snails. They are simply snails. And then we have the periwinkle, which is quite the rough periwinkle, and the flat periwinkle. They are closely related and very common in Icelandic rocky shores. Then usually deeper in the lower zones, we have whelks, such as the dog whelk and also the common whelk. Usually swimming around but not laying on the coast are sea slugs. These are, they're just similar to snails on land, but these slugs, they have let me see, sorry, there's a little, my computer is freezing just a bit. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so where were we? The sea slugs. So the sea slugs have outer gills, and that's actually where they get their Icelandic name from. Bertálknar means that they have the gills without any cover. So they come in various sizes and shapes and color, and are very beautiful actually, and swim around in a very with very beautiful wave movement, and they are often seen by divers that are diving in shallow waters. But the sea slug is, for example, here on the top picture. Then we have lots of bivalves. Bivalves are clams and mussels. The common mussel is very common in Icelandic coastal areas and is also a common food. Then we have the horse mussel as well, Kiamium, which is, don't have the English word for it, we call it mæruskell, and also the wrinkled rock borer. These are just examples of common bivalves, which you can see in Icelandic shores, and some of them can be eaten. Let's look at other other molluscs. For example, the ribbon worms, which you can see on the top picture. It's a flat worm that can be found in puddles and usually where some water is when the tide is out, but they prefer swimming around. They don't like lying on the dry rock. And then they look a little bit like ribbon, hence the name. But then we have other types of mollusks called annelids. Annelids are worms which are segmented, and some have scales and some don't. Like oligocetons, they're just soft-bodied segmented worms, whereas polycetons are often soft-bodied as well, but sometimes have scales, like the 15-scaled worm, which you can see on the second picture from the top, and a similar one called the 12-scaled worm. These are polycetons. Polycetons means worms with many hairs, and they all have these hairs growing to the sides or alongside their appendages to the side. It's like small little legs, but these are mainly, these are hairs. But actually sometimes they can be used to move around in the mud. We also have the sandworm, which is the third picture from the top, and the Keratulus, which we don't have here on this slide, and then the spiral tube worm, which we'll probably see on the shore because they are often growing on kelp, and they are these little spiral shells, very small, only a few millimeters in diameter, and but if you look at them in using a microscope, for example, you can better see that these are beautifully structured animals, and they have polycetons, just like their other polycheton relatives. That is, they have brushes or hairs, which they use to, for example, they can use it to filter out food from their environment, and sometimes they can use the hairs just to move around in the mud and so forth. And another type of animals which we can find in the seashore are the arthropods. Arthropods means just that these are animals with outer shell made out of chitin, and their body is segmented, and their legs or appendages are segmented as well. We have sea spiders. Then barnacles, and barnacles are actually arthropods. Not many people realize that, because inside the barnacle shell lies an arthropod, kind of on its back, and its feet or appendages it sometimes sticks them out of the shell and uses them to collect small particles from the ocean, and then it closes up again. And living in such a dense shell actually gives this animal the chance to tolerate dry periods. So they are often found high up in the shore, where the tides, well, in the splash zone, for example, or just below the splash zone. Since they can tolerate a lot of long periods of dryness, because within their shell is where it continues to be moist. So, okay, another type of arthropods are isopods. Isopod means an animal with appendages of even length. So their feet have similar length. There's not a great variation in the length of their feet. A type of an isopod on this slide is actually the lower one to the left. The brownish one, very beautiful creature, just a few centimeters long. And then other types of arthropods, which are very common in Icelandic rocky seashores, are amphipods. And we find them underneath rocks and within the seaweed. And all these arthropods, apart from the barnacle, are very important food source for many birds and fish and other species that live in coastal areas. Now, larger arthropods would be the crabs, and very common crabs that you can find in the seashore, walking around whether the tide is in or the tide is out, are, for example, the common shore crab, the great spider crab, and also the hermit crab. The hermit crab is the small crab that needs to find a house and uses shells, usually from snails, gastropods. And sometimes they can't find shell of a proper size or the appropriate size. So they sometimes just use junk, plastic junk, and you can see them squeeze their little bodies inside of different kinds of plastics. Other types of animals that live on the seashore are echinoderms. They all have rather hard outer layer. They don't have shell like the arthropods, but they have some chitin growing out of their skin. And these are sea stars, and they are, here in Iceland we have the common starfish, which can grow quite large, and you can see that to the top right, and then the blood sea star. We also have brittle stars, which have these long and wavy appendages like the one in the middle to the right, and then sea urchins, which have these needles growing out of their skin. And the sea urchins we have in Iceland, we have mainly two species, or at least two dominant species, and these are either the edible sea urchin, which is pinkish colored on this slide, and then we have the northern sea urchin, which is more green and smaller. Other species we can find on the seashore are, for example, sea squirts. Sea squirts are incredibly magnificent animals. They are actually more closely related to vertebrates or humans or other vertebrates, other mammals, or fish, or whatever there is with a bone. Of the soft-bodied invertebrates, the sea squirts, the pink one you see here on the top right picture, are actually close relatives to us bony animals. Then, of course, in the seashore there are some fish species that can live in very shallow waters, primarily the butterfish and also the bull trout. No, sorry, the bull roach, sometimes called the father lasher. Now, this was the end of the introduction to the seashore, and I hope you will enjoy the seashore even more by going and visiting it yourself.